Movie Health Podcast is proudly supported by Telemoods by eClapper Project Inc. Telemoods is a mobile application that recommends which movies and TV series to watch by matching the user's mood and the real-time offer of all streaming platforms. Download Telemoods today.
Hi, this is Catherine and welcome to the Movie Health Podcast. We talk about movies and mental health. In this episode, we talk to Monique Van Zelm Felix, a clinical social worker, clinical director, and specialist neurodivergence therapist. Monique also happens to be my long-standing social work supervisor. Welcome, Monique.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me on.
I was so excited to ask you and so happy that you said yes. When I asked you what your favorite movie was, you said Good Will Hunting. And of course, I just want to know what made you choose that film and what makes it your favorite movie.
Well, it's a fairly old film. I don't know what year it was made. Do you know?
Yeah, I can do a quick intro if it'll just jog our memories a bit, if you want. But yes, Good Will Hunting was in 1997. It's a drama indie film directed by Gus Van Sant. I think I'm saying his name right, not sure. Written by Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, starring both of them, Robert Williams, Minnie Driver, Stellan Skarsgard, and Casey Affleck. And the movie has won many awards, including Original Screenplay and Best Supporting Actor, which was Robert Williams. And basically the summary is that a mathematical genius faces an emotional crisis and he gets support from a psychiatrist played by Robert Williams. From there, what makes it your favorite movie?
I think that it's one of my favorite movies because the themes in the movie and also the types of characters that are in the movie, I really connect with both. I connect with the themes and I connect with the characters as well. I think because I am a therapist, like when I first watched this movie, I wasn't a therapist, but I think probably I always knew that that's where I wanted to go with my life. So I think probably in that way, just in terms of the general theme of the movie, that's what pushed me into it. But I think really the movie is about people who come from adversity, people who come from places where they're not offered opportunity. And then it's sort of juxtaposition between, and I think that that's sort of a key theme throughout the movie, which, you know, it's that sense of justice, I guess. And that's a really big part of who I am in my life and what I've decided to do with my life. I think that's why I like it, because of the themes and characters that they developed are really deep and I think important.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the characters and themes and scenes even, they're very deep and powerful. I'm really curious, do you remember how old you were when you first watched the movie?
I don't remember, but I would have been very young. So in 1997, I would have been 9 or 10. I think I watched it in that sort of those preteen years around that time. And then, of course, I've watched it many times since then. Yeah, I'm going to take a guess in the preteen era.
Oh, wow. Okay. Because I can't remember when I watched it, but I know I've seen it many times as well. And I think it has the same kind of impact on me. For you, like after all these years watching it again, you know, does it impact you differently, like with the different milestones that you've had in your life and obviously you choosing to be a therapist in a different way now, I guess?
Actually, when I watched it the other night, I finished the movie and I said to my friend, because I roped her into watching it with me, oh my gosh, it's still my favorite movie of all time after all these years. Apart from just that it's been more than 20 years since it came out, so it's getting a little bit dated now. So there were some scenes, you know, we've had the Me Too movement now, for example, and so there was like some sexual harassment and some power, sort of interesting power dynamics between some of the professors at Harvard and the students and things like this. So there were those types of things that, you know, were just obvious, but it's just a sort of a time marker, I guess, that, you know, now I think really differently about those things. But I think at the time that was, people weren't aware that that wasn't okay and that that wasn't a good stereotype to be perpetuating, and or that wasn't even a good thing that a teacher should be doing. In 2023, it's just shocking how far we've come with our thinking with that. I don't think that we would see things like that in a movie today unless it was a movie about, you know, sexual harassment.
Yeah.
And or power dynamics, I guess. So some things like that hit differently, but the core themes of it, I guess that, Matt Damon plays the main character, who is a mathematical genius, is the way that they describe it in the introduction. And I think that I really connect with that character. Like, he's very misunderstood. And I also really connected with the masking that he does. So he's the whole movie trying to be something that he deep down knows that he isn't. And he's also very, very confused about that. And so because I work with neurodivergent people and I come from a family of neurodivergent people and I identify myself as well, I really connected with that character even more so now that I'm sort of older and I've got more personal reflections about who I am as a person and how I'm different and whether or not that's okay and all that sort of stuff and that self-acceptance. I really enjoyed the other night watching him move through those phases into accepting who he is and accepting the opportunities provided to him once he did that. So yeah, I guess to answer your question, I always go on tangents, but I think, yes, it did hit differently, but I still loved it equally.
Yeah, definitely. The process and journey that he goes on for his inner healing and growth is so powerful. And I think it's one of the most beautiful things to witness in a film. And I know there's really iconic scenes with Robin Williams as the therapist. Did you have a particular favorite scene? I know it's probably hard to choose, but would you say any of them really stand out to you?
I think the scene that's of course, coming to mind about being an iconic scene is when, of course, he breaks down and Robin Williams is telling him, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. And this was a scene in which, just in case any of the listeners haven't watched the movie, it's a scene in which Robin Williams is reviewing his sort of Matt Damon's history, I guess. And I love it how I'm using the actual names of the act. And he's reviewing his history, a lot of physical abuse and that sort of thing. And then I think why it's powerful for me is not that it was an aha sort of moment, a therapeutic moment, but what was very powerful for me working as a therapist now was that Matt Damon asked Robin Williams, have you had experience with that? And Robin Williams gave a clinical professional answer, which was, well, yes, I've counseled many people over the years who have been through physical abuse. And Matt Damon just looks at him and said, no, I mean, have you had experience with that? And Robin Williams says, personally, and he's like, yeah. And then Robin Williams starts to share and disclose some of his story, which was a really good example of how important personal disclosures can be in the therapy room and how powerful they can be. So I think, and then after that, of course, they have the big therapeutic moment, very iconic scene where Matt Damon starts crying and finally all his walls come down and Robin Williams is saying, it's not your fault, it's not your fault, it's not your fault. That definitely, now that I'm nearly 40 and I've been working as a therapist for nearly 20 years, that scene is so important to me as an example of what can happen when we are vulnerable with our clients in the therapy room, but also just in life generally. So I think that that's my favorite scene. And also that's a really core part of who I am as a person and as a therapist. And so when I'm mentoring and working with others, we always explore sort of, the use of sense of self. I guess the sense of identity that you have, how comfortable you are with that and how much you accept yourself being a tool as to how much you will share and disclose with your client. The other day I was talking with someone and they were really shocked that when you come to do disability social work here in Australia, in the last 5 or 6 years or so, there's been a huge movement around lived experience which has really been led by the adult autistic community. And so we've had a language change from person with a disability or person with autism to disabled people or to neurodivergent people. And that was led by, adults in the autistic community who have always felt, really misunderstood. And so now, because of that advocacy that all those autistic people have been doing around language and around self-disclosure and the value of being neurodivergent or having lived experience as a carer or as a neurodivergent person yourself, I think that now we're much more comfortable with just personal disclosures and using parts of our story to have an impact in a powerful way to connect with clients. I think that scene from the movie today in 2023 is more relevant than ever, even though the movie is old. Yeah. The other thing about that scene is that I think that the idea about professional boundaries and use of self in therapy is changing a little bit. Of course, we need boundaries, of course, and we need very firm boundaries with some clients, more than others, depending on what we're seeing them for. But I think that what happens there in the movie is more a picture of how modern therapy is. And it was a little like that movie that came out last year by Jonah Hill, where he interviewed his psychiatrist. That was also a really powerful example of how transference and countertransference may not always be a terrible thing. And maybe there can be dual growth in the therapy room, which I think is quite controversial, but I think it's becoming more accepted that these can be quite powerful therapeutic tools.
Yeah. No, I love all the points you've mentioned. And it kind of reminds me the first time I met you when I was looking for a supervisor. I always tell people, I feel like I hit the jackpot with you because as soon as I met you, like you were so warm and approachable. And it's like similar to like Robin Williams' character. He was just so easy to talk to. He just had this really deep understanding of what was happening for a person. And that particular scene is my favorite as well because his gentle persistence and his vulnerability were able to put down all of Matt Damon's character's walls because he had so many. I guess the whole movie kind of shows his walls like slowly coming down one by one. I love that you mentioned lived experience. And that's something that's really important to me too, because, part of why I'm so passionate about the disability space is because I have quite a few family friends and my auntie had Down syndrome. I think just understanding like the trauma and like even like caregiver burnout and living vicarious trauma and all of that, like I think that's all so important to look at. And I really love how it was in 1997, but it does have such a modern take to therapy. I think will always be relevant.
I'm sure if you were a therapist at the time when this came out, it would have been like heavily criticized, as Stutz was last year. And there was a lot of talk, a lot of criticism around the way that film was done and the boundaries and all of this, which probably a lot of it's valid. But yeah, it's interesting how it's now seen as a much more powerful and appropriate tool than ever. And yeah, I like the way that you described his gentle persistence, because I do more so just on a personal level, I really connect with Matt Damon's character rather than a therapist, which is interesting. The way, now that you mention it, the way that Robin Williams did do that gentle persistence, which is a great way of describing it. And he just took his time. He wasn't wanting to put himself into a position of power over him, and he wasn't wanting to place himself in an expert position. And I think that's really, really powerful in my work. When I work with a lot of people that have had lots and lots of professionals in their life, and usually by the time they are referred to me, it's because they won't engage with anyone, they won't go and see anyone, they won't go to a clinic space, they don't need therapy, they don't need help, but, perhaps they've also got lots and lots of issues that's making it difficult for them to, live a good life and live the life that they want. So I think that I connect with the way that he worked, to just taking your time, going at the client's pace and making sure that you don't push people any particular way to serve yourself.
Exactly. He kind of like removed the ego from the equation. He was like really focused on Matt Damon. And I love what you said. And I think that's also why, I love having you as my supervisor, because like with film therapy that I do, it's very similar how my current clients come from like, they've seen many different like psychologists or other therapists and it hasn't necessarily worked for them. They haven't connected. But because film is such a like an essential medium for them that they absolutely love and like are passionate about, it's something that we can like work on together. And it's like very collaborative in terms of like problem solving and, like understanding what's happening for them. I love that. Would you say that Matt Damon's your favorite character then in the movie?
In the movie, yeah. I also just like the friendship between Matt Damon and Ben Affleck as well.
Yeah.
I think that that's like very rare to have in life. In my experience, it's very, very rare to have a friend that will stick by you through thick and thin and everything through your whole life. And even when you're making bad choices and even this and even that. And so I quite liked that dynamic too. And also because the real life dynamic is that they are childhood friends to this day, like the two of them. So I thought that was quite cute. Now, that, those two, I think they're in their 50s now. And so I was just thinking about that and thinking, oh, that's so nice that they wrote this movie together when they were like very young. And then they won all these awards and stuff. And then since then, they've been in heaps of movies together and they're still, best friends today, which I thought was just a nice little sort of side plot.
Yeah, definitely. I love, Matt Damon and Ben Affleck's friendship is very iconic.
Yes.
And it's crazy how they wrote this script when they were in their 20s. And basically they did it because I think they were kind of desperate for work.
Yeah.
Being taken seriously. And then this gave them the big break that they needed. But the genius of the script alone is so powerful. And the fact that they had that kind of insight at that time, like I'm not sure where they got it from, but yeah, they're hilarious. And I think you can definitely see like their friendship shining through in the actual film.
This is incredibly powerful because it just addresses so many social issues at the time, which are still important and relevant today.
Yeah.
Like touched on, I mentioned before, Me Too and sort of feminism and the way that feminism has changed in the last 10 years. That movie is still incredibly relevant, representing stereotypes that are still exist today, but are much less accepted. It represented poverty, people who grow up in poverty without opportunity. And then on the other side and the other half of that, we haven't even talked about it, but there was the love story between Minnie Driver and Damon and the power of that. And then in the end, choosing relationship over work and opportunity, even though Matt Damon came from such a background without any opportunity, he decided in the end that the most important thing is to have relationship. And, really, if we're talking about mental health and movies, that's, if we think about what keeps us healthy, mentally healthy and physically healthy, the number one thing is relationships, actions and attachments, if we want to use clinical language, attachments. And I think back in 1997, the understanding of that in the therapy room would have been slightly different because we've become very, very attachment-based in the last 20 years. So I think as well, it was ahead of its time in that way too.
Yeah, definitely. I love how you mentioned the relationship between Matt Damon and Minnie Driver because like there were particular scenes there that just got me so emotional. Vulnerability again, like it really was Minnie Driver's character, like being able to like actually be honest about how she was feeling and not necessarily care what the response was, even though it was heartbreaking and devastating. But then at the end, Matt Damon realizes actually like, yeah, I do want to prioritize this relationship and like she matters to me. And he could finally, I guess, admit that he loved her in the way that he couldn't. But that was only possible because of his kind of breakthrough and his like transformative moment with Robert Williams' character.
It was almost even like a coming of age film for Matt Damon. Is that makes
Yeah.
Almost like he sort of missed that because he didn't have those supportive attachments in the childhood years. And so then when he sort of did get finally the supportive attachment in the form of a therapist, he was finally able to put those walls down, be vulnerable and grow up essentially. So yeah, it was interesting.
Yeah. And I remember like when I saw Counselor years back, she was referring to that as like a corrective emotional experience. Like I feel like that's what Matt Damon experienced while he was working with Robert Williams, because I guess he did experience abuse and obviously like an abuse of power, but he got the complete opposite from Robin Williams, which is what he needed in his lifetime.
That's a lovely description, a corrective emotional experience. I love that. Yeah.
Yeah, I've never forgotten that term when I was introduced to it. But yeah, what kind of themes did you find like resonate with you the most in the movie?
I think I've mentioned them all. The themes that resonated most with me were the key theme really was the masking and the inability, the absolute torturous inability of Matt Damon to mask his vulnerability and how torturous that was for him to do. And I connect with that personally a lot. And it took me a really long time to be able to be comfortable with my own vulnerability and to be able to share that with others and to be not afraid of the results. So I think that really is the key theme. And for a lot of the people that I work with now, it's that we work on, being comfortable and okay with being yourself and knowing that whatever the repercussions of that are can't be worse than pretending that you're something you're not.
Yeah, that's deeply powerful. And I think, like, for me, you've mentioned so many things that I've written down myself in preparation for this episode. But I think, like, for me, like, the real, like, major theme was change. And the fact that even just like one or a few conversations can change your life and break down barriers, like internal barriers that you have. Because Matt Damon's character, Will, he was very precocious and defensive at the beginning. But the fact that like he was able to allow himself to be confronted and be challenged through therapy and through relationship with other people, that's something like will stick with me. And I think probably like resonates with like so many people who watch the movie. Yeah. And I think, again, like with therapy, the fact that Robin Williams was able to like build rapport and be honest and even use humor and like share stories, I think that kind of approachability and that warmth is also a therapeutic tool. It's not just about like being clinical or being serious, but also like showing who you are, like you said, being vulnerable, showing your sense of humor, I think is really important too. Yeah.
I found like if you don't show yourself, you can't build rapport, which is really, really different to, for example, psychodynamically trained people. For example, it was always like, don't wear your wedding ring and dress conservatively, sleeves down to the wrist, necks, and tie your hair back and all this sort of stuff, minimal makeup. That was the teaching that people used to get a really long time ago. And now it's completely flipped, in my opinion. I'm probably on the far left of this, but do use yourself. Do put up things about yourself on your website so that people can get to you and decide if you're a good fit. Do have social media accounts where you share stories and resources and this sort of thing. And so it's powerful.
It's very, very powerful. And like that reminds me, I don't know if you know the Cinema Therapy YouTube channel. Have you ever heard of that or seen the episode? Yeah, it's amazing. I'll send you the link. But basically, it's like two men who were like childhood buddies. And one of them's a licensed therapist in America, and the other one's like a film lover. And they basically review like movies and scenes from film from a therapeutic perspective. And it's called Cinema Therapy in 2 words. And they did one about Good Will Hunting, which I rewatched yesterday. And it was amazing because the therapist basically says, like, the only way that a client can heal is through a relationship with a therapist. Like, it's not just about like therapeutic skill or technique, but it's actually the relationship and the rapport that you build and the trust that you share.
100% agree. I'm a huge advocate for that. In fact, I often tell my clients 80% of the work that we do in this room is based on the relationship and the trust that we have together. So if you don't like me and you don't respect me and you think that I say ludicrous things that don't make sense, then you need to let me know that, because we need to get you another therapist, right? And, I won't be offended, right?
Yeah.
Because this is your time and you need to get benefit out of this. So if our relationship isn't going 100% well, and that doesn't mean you can't have tension in a relationship. You can have tension in a therapeutic relationship, which can be a really important tool. I mean, probably one of the most important tools. If we can grab that tension, hold onto it and use it to create therapeutic progress, it's more powerful than anything that we really have. But it's, that trust, that respect, that ability to create a safe space, a safe space meaning it is a therapeutic space, is absolutely crucial. And that's based on the relationship. One of the theories that I pretty much base everything on in my entire life, work or otherwise, is this guy called Klaus Grave, who's a German guy. I'm sure I've talked to you about this before, but just for the list. And so he developed a theory about neural consistency, and he published it across many platforms, but predominantly in a book called Neuropsychotherapy, which I read in 2012, and it pretty much changed my life. So this theory about neural consistency, basically it means like, how do we stay mentally well? So he says that there's 4 pillars that we base our mental health on. And then we either avoid or approach things based upon how well those 4 things are going. So he talks about number 1, and they do go in order, so number 1, attach, i.e. relationships.
Yes.
Number 2, control and orientation. And so that means how we understand the things around us and the experiences happening to us, or the things that we are doing and how we understand those. And therefore, that gives us a sense of control. Then that's number 2. Number 3 is pleasure maximization and pain avoidance. So, of course, that's obvious, going towards things that make us feel good and moving away from things that make us feel bad. And then the 4th one is self-enhancement, which is really about how I always get a little bit confused about this one, but my understanding is it's about how we see ourselves in relation to others and how we position ourselves, I guess. So how we're making that comparison. So Klaus Grave, developed this theory on neural consistency with those 4 pillars. And he basically says that if things aren't going well in your attachments, then of course you will try to understand that using control. And then when you can't control that, you will go towards maximizing pleasure and avoiding pain. And so that might look like drug abuse, alcohol use, et cetera, maladaptive coping mechanisms, eating, binge eating and things like that. And then we go down and sort of when those 3 things, none of those 3 things are really happening well, we're sort of down in self-enhancement in a bit of a crisis because we're comparing ourselves to others. It doesn't look good. We don't feel good. And then we're, really having serious mental health issues, once we're down in that space. So in this movie, those 4 pillars are very well represented throughout the entire movie. And there's a lot of examples of in a very linear way, actually, in a very clear way of those things happening. And particularly, we haven't talked about this character, but one of the characters, the professor who finds Will hunting and he is trying to mentor him. No, he wants to mentor him, but he's not as smart as. There's a lot of this stuff around like control and orientation and some issues around power and authority and things like that. And so his character fits like quite well into that model, but they all do. They all fit well. So the whole movie is about relationships, and any of the characters, when they aren't doing well, it's because the relationship has been attacked. Then every character then moves into control and orientation, and then pleasure maximization and pain avoidance. And when Matt Damon, if we go back to that iconic scene that we talked about earlier, when he reaches that crisis point, it is because he's right all the way down in self-enhancement, right? So the relationships are gone. He can't control things. He can't make himself feel good. So he's all the way down there thinking, what am I doing with myself? What good things do I have in my life? And I'm being challenged from every person that I know on the things that I'm doing. So that theory of neural consistency by Klaus Grave, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, is honestly the most clearest ways to explain how we actually keep ourselves mentally well.
I remember when you first mentioned this to me, because you have so much knowledge, your treasure trove of knowledge, which I really value. And you're right. I think like the film really shows that in every character, and even the relationship between the professor and the therapist, the fact that they were college buddies, and like the tension and like the ego battles that they experience as well, and the kind of like resolution and their like acceptance of each other and themselves at the end. That was actually like beautifully shown as well, without like too many words either. I really like how you mentioned tension being an important part of the therapeutic relationship, because I think, like one of the last scenes when Robin Williams asks Matt Damon to like walk out the door, and he's like, what do you want? Like, what are you passionate about? And he's asking these clear, direct questions to Matt, which you can't even answer. Because I guess like everything else, like, relationships, attachment, that's all like he is in crisis point with all of those things. So he didn't even know. He wasn't self-aware or like emotionally intelligent at the time to know that. So yeah, I really like your points are so insightful. It makes me think of the movie in a different way as well. Like as much as I love the movie, but seeing it like with the Klaus Grave theory, I think, yeah, that's really powerful too. And because you mentioned mental well-being, and I was going to ask you what your mental health tips would be for listeners.
And you know what? I was thinking about this before the podcast because I thought you might ask me something like that. And actually, the entire movie Good Will Hunting is about self-acceptance, right? And it's about being able to be comfortable with who you are and being okay with vulnerability and being okay with that you've got wounds and that these are part of you, and accepting all those parts of you. And I think that that's it. So if you can accept every part of yourself as important, even the parts that you don't like. And so there's an exercise that we do sometimes in EMDR therapy or schema therapy where we ask the client to close your eyes, or sometimes not the eyes closed, depending, but we ask the client usually close your eyes and imagine a meeting place. And we ask the client to invite all the parts of themselves to come into the meeting place. And then, we explore what each of the parts want to say and why they've made themselves known in the therapy session and that sort of thing. And that's a really powerful way to understand which parts of yourself you are really shaming and giving a hard time. And so I think of that when I think of being mentally well. I think of all the parts of myself that I am absolutely ashamed of, that I don't want to show to people. I don't want people to know they exist. If they do find out they exist, I try to push them back into the box, like I wish I didn't show them. And then I think when I really made a leap forward with my own mental health, it was when I was able to fully, completely accept those parts as a part of me and just work with them compassionately to feel that I understand those parts, I accept those parts, and that they're with me for a reason. And it might be to protect me from something, or it might be to help me to understand something, or it might be to help me to learn, to be better, to do differently. So I think that's it. It's self-compassion and acceptance. And if you can do that, you should be able to live pretty well.
Yeah, it's like the fundamental thing, isn't it? And it's a thing that we kind of all struggle with in our own way. But from that self-compassion, self-acceptance, that's able to kind of expand to all our other relationships and the way that we live our life and all of that. So I love that you mentioned that. I know that you're a great proponent of EMDR, and I love like internal family systems theory, which also goes with parts work. So I think you were going to say something. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I didn't mention IFS, but there's a lot of different therapeutic modalities that use parts work. But IFS, schema, EMDR, anything where we're really sort of getting down into the nitty gritty of who someone is and what their experiences mean. And I think now we're getting a lot of these somatic based therapies where we're really learning about trauma and stress being stored in the body and how we can help people in identifying body sensations and things like that as a super important and crucial part to being able to reprocess and deal with memories, traumas and experiences. So I think we're sort of moving more and more into a really deep level of understanding about that self-acceptance and self-compassion work. And I think generally society too, like young people now are just so much more accepting about things and so much less judgmental. Even people, in my age, of course, I work with a lot of teenagers, right? And I work with a lot of autistic teenagers who are, for example, trans teenagers, because we have a high number of LGBTQIA plus people in the neurodivergent community. And when I'm working with those people, they've got all these friends and other young people around them just completely accepting them and saying, yeah, that's cool that you're trans and you want to change your gender. And, when I was a kid, that would not be a conversation that we would hear. We would have heard horrible things about people who were trans. So I think that society is changing a lot. Young people are really helping us to have compassion and acceptance, and to they're sort of rerouting the way that the fabric of society operates.
Yeah, it seems like a hopeful future in that way, doesn't it? Like having faith in humanity and knowing that this generation has been more accepting and inclusive, and like diversity is something that has been more accepted. And like that's a really beautiful thing. Thank you so much. Yeah.
That's okay. I was just going to say that I think that there's been a lot of work that has had to happen in order for this like acceptance and inclusivity and all of that stuff to happen. Like in our sector, in the disability sector here in Australia, there has been literally 30 or 40 years of like hard advocacy from disabled people, autistic people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All people who have been sort of marginalized and vulnerable in this space, doing advocacy, getting people out of institutions and getting them out into the community and living in mainstream settings and going to mainstream schools and really working on that idea of inclusion. And that's just one example, Before I mentioned about the trans community, which has had an absolutely huge, coming out, I guess, in the last 5 to 10 years. there's a lot of people doing a lot of work for this to happen. And I think now we're just, starting to see the results of that.
It is like many decades of advocacy and behind the lines kind of and grassroots work for sure. Was there anything else you wanted to share today, Minnie?
No, I don't think I want to share anything. But if anyone's listening to this and they want to get in touch with me because they thought something was interesting that I said, they're very welcome to www.ourfuturefocus.com.au is my website. Feel welcome to head there and send me an email or whatever. Take a look at some of the resources and things up on the website. But yeah, love to hear from people, and it's been such a pleasure that you've had me.
Thank you so much. It was so good to talk about Good Will Hunting, which is one of my favorite movies as well. And I noticed quite a few other therapists and even psychologists say the same thing. And yeah, I love your mental health tips. And thank you so much for all the work that we've done together as well. And really excited to see where the future takes us.